3 for 3 going back to, again, the early 80s. The pattern was go negative, start to rebound, and then a recession starts. Okay, so that's why I think these two things would be good things for you to track if you want to just sort of follow at home and see where the economy is heading. Again, consumer sentiment and these interest rate spreads. Okay, I don't know how I did on the interest rate things. I see a lot of dozing, but not too bad. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure visiting with you, and I hope to talk to a lot of you after. Okay, thank you very much.
I'm going to talk about interest rates for the next 30 minutes, so if anybody needs coffee, just grab it and we can go. I saw some people on our table reaching it a little while ago. Okay, so the plan today is to I'll give you a brief overview, just follow up on a few national outlook points, and then I want to dive deep into kind of what drives growth in a region and kind of how this general region is doing and kind of what factors we can look at to kind of get an idea of what the long-term outlook for the region looks like. Just to start out, you can see it's actually pretty small, but this is my disclaimer at the bottom. So these are my views. They're not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Fed system. So when it gets to Q&A, feel free to ask me anything you want, and I'll either give you my boss's talking points or I'll give you my own opinion, and I'll try to distinguish between those two. Okay, so just to kind of get started out, I think growth in 2018 was stronger than we expected. I'm going to move this box one second. From the Fed standpoint, I think we knew that there was going to be some uptick from the stimulus, and we definitely saw that in the data. As you can see here, kind of this red line is going to be the FOMC, so the Monetary Policy Committee. They submit forecasts 4 times a year for what they view the outlook for the economy to look like. So that's going to be the red line from last year. And as you can see, the growth definitely was stronger than expected. A lot of this was actually not necessarily from the tax cuts, but actually additional contributions from government spending. So we saw about 0.5 percentage point growth in the U.S. economy was driven just by additional federal government spending coming in from additional spending, not necessarily just from the tax cut. But regardless, we did see kind of growth stronger than expected. The forecast, again, for this year is we mentioned, is 2.3% from the committee at this point, but the expectations are that this growth is going to slow over the next couple of years. And the key factors driving this are kind of twofold. So one is going to be demographic. We just have an aging population. Labor force growth is really slow. There's just no way that with the labor force growth that we have right now that you could expect to see the economy accelerate at a faster pace. The only way that that could happen would be if we saw productivity growth really start to accelerate. Unfortunately, we've been in this stage for a very long time now where productivity growth has been very slow. There's a lot of kind of confusion as to what exactly is driving this slow productivity growth, but I could spend 3 hours talking about that, and I'm not going to do that, so we're just going to move on. But generally speaking, we expect that the economy is going to slow down to a trend rate more or less around 2%, maybe a little bit below 2% is about trend growth for the U.S. economy at this point. Tim mentioned the forecast. We don't have the fourth quarter numbers in yet, but I think we're going to get a number probably around 2.5% for the fourth quarter. I also made a note about that. First quarter numbers will probably get something a little less than 2%. That's going to be driven by probably some challenges in estimating seasonal factors in the wintertime, as well as about maybe 0.2 of a point off from the federal government shutdown, also dragging on growth in the first quarter. Looking at the unemployment rate forecast, it's more or less been on track. So we expected some kind of slowdown. We saw that just a little bit, actually dipped a bit lower than the committee expected. And projections are actually that we still have a little bit of movement to go to get this unemployment rate down a little bit lower. Now I think long term, there's kind of these stories about this passing over into kind of faster wage growth and tighter labor markets, and that's going to raise inflation pressures. We haven't really seen that, and there's not a lot of evidence at this point that trade-off that we saw in the 1980s and 1970s really exists today. A lot of that we kind of pat ourselves on the back for at the Fed and say that inflation expectations have become much better anchored. So businesses aren't willing to say, well, we're going to get 5% wage growth because they know that if wage growth does accelerate too much and we see these inflation pressures, the Fed will increase interest rates to kind of slow the economy down and keep inflation in check. But we do expect to see the unemployment rate dip down just a bit more. Inflation pressures have been more or less in line with the Fed's target, so 2% is kind of the steady number that we look at. A combination of some of these tariffs on steel and aluminum, a kind of run up in energy prices earlier on in the year, kind of pushed inflation a bit above that 2%, but as you can see in the last couple of months, it's came back down to the target. And again, projections are at this point that we'll kind of see that steady inflation rate about 2%. So in a lot of ways, the market is kind of at this equilibrium. So we're seeing kind of steady growth. Inflation rates are about where we'd expect them, unemployment rates low. And for the most part, even though 2018 was a strong year, growth was still more or less in line with that potential rate of about 2%. So that slowdown that we saw in kind of the turmoil in the fourth quarter, a lot of it, I think, is just markets coming to realize that the growth that we had was not going to be sustainable, and the economy was going to slow back down to a level that was closer to its potential. Now, when we look at the kind of the monetary policy pieces, and this is my only slide on interest rates, I promise, we more or less followed the path that we expected. The economy moved along the path that we had projected, maybe a little bit higher on inflation, maybe a bit faster on growth, but the interest rate increases were more or less on that path. The committee, as of the December meeting, so this was 2 meetings ago now when they released their projections, expected there probably to be a couple more rate increases in 2019. At the most recent meeting that just concluded, the Fed chair gave a press conference, and he kind of talked about that there's this patience, that we're going to wait and see kind of how the data comes in, because there's clearly more uncertainty today than there was back in December, or kind of back in December. We're missing a lot of data as well. So we'll wait and see how that data comes in, and then make adjustments accordingly. I think we're about right, that Tim was about right, that the downside risks probably are a bit higher today than they were a year ago. So financial markets are putting pretty low probabilities of any rate increases this year right now. So probably maybe a 10% chance of an additional rate increase. So I think we'll expect in March, when the FOMC meets again, these numbers will probably come down a little bit to a lower level of interest rates. Okay, so recession probabilities. I think, first of all, if you look at probabilities for a recession today, the best way to look at it is to say, what's job growth look like? The jobs are really strong. What's industrial production look like? That's weakened a little bit, but still looks pretty good. Income growth has been pretty stable, and retail sales were pretty good. Holiday sales were relatively strong. Probability that we're in a recession today is very, very low. So that's what this chart is showing you right here. So if you look at kind of the indicators for today, they look pretty good. Yield curve, so this is kind of taking these, making a probability of a recession based on that yield curve that Tim talked about. And what that's showing you is that the probability of recession today, due to that yield curve, is about 10%. About 21% is the probability that we're looking at a recession toward December 2019. And just to follow up on why is it that this inversion of a yield curve could potentially cause a recession, there's a lot of speculation. What I found from reading a lot of different research papers is it probably comes from bank lending. So this idea that if banks are taking in deposits at a low interest rate and long that they lend at are high, it gives them a lot of wiggle room as to kind of what kind of loans that they can make, and they can have their margins there. As this yield curve gets flattened out, they're going to start tightening lending standards because they want to make sure that they're going to make profitable loans, and that pullback in lending standards is probably what causes a slowdown in the economy as the yield curve gets flat or potentially inverts. So that's the other place to look, is probably at bank lending, and seeing if that contracts if this yield curve does invert. And then the last part is interest rate spreads on bonds is another place to look as a potential recession indicator. So this idea that you have high-rated corporate bonds, AAA corporate bonds, and the spread between that and kind of lower-rated bonds like junk bonds that are rated BBB or lower. And as those interest rate spreads start to widen, that tends to be a fairly good indicator of the economy slowing down, because those are the companies that are at more risk for bankruptcy. So lenders don't want to, they want a higher premium in making those loans. And that recession, and taking a recession probability based on those interest rate spreads, it has jumped up a little bit. But again, it's not as high as kind of the 50 to 60% that you would expect to see that would actually signal a recession. These three series that I showed are all publicly available from different Federal Reserve sources. So you can also track these over time. They're updated on a weekly basis. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn to the local economy. And just one picture to kind of capture the main theme that I always try to tell everybody, which is the St. Louis metropolitan area, which is the 15-county region that makes up Madison County, St. Clair County, St. Charles County, St. Louis County, and the city. That's kind of the bulk of it. That's about 80% of the metro area's output. And then kind of the surrounding counties that go out a little bit further. St. Louis's economy doesn't expand when the national economy is contracting. The reason that we've seen such a great string of great projects and developments is the national economy has done really well. That's where we work for national firms. We sell products all over the country and all over the globe. If the U.S. economy continues to perform well, I think we'll expect to see that the local economy will also do well. So I think when you look to a national outlook, you can kind of map it back down to the local area. As Tim mentioned, you kind of take the numbers, and I tell people to multiply them by like 0.6, 0.7. You know, somewhere around there kind of gives you a general trend of what a regional forecast will look like. Unfortunately, the numbers that we have today show that the local economy actually accelerate the way the national economy did in 2018. We kind of stabilized. And this is probably twofold. One is coal contributions to the region have been quite significant for a long time. We have a lot of energy companies. They took a big hit, and they have for a long time here. So that's been one drag on the economy. The other piece is that healthcare is becoming a larger and larger component of our regional economy. And that's an area that's really not that cyclical, which is a good thing. But it also means that when things get better, that sector doesn't necessarily do as well. It's going to be driven by more demographic factors like that. Okay, so U.S. 2-something% growth. What I want to do now is make a point that if you look across the country, yeah, U.S. averaged 2-something% over the long term. That's what this blue line is here. The gray standard errors here are going to show you kind of plus or minus, kind of where 60% of the different metropolitan areas in the country fall in here. So there's some places in the country that have seen steady growth, 5-6% a year. There's other places in the country that have actually seen steady declines in their economy for long periods of time. So up here on the top, that's going to be San Jose, California. So 7% growth, and it's been pretty steady for a long period of time here. And then New Orleans. So economy that's really been in a recession for a very, very long time. So while these national average numbers do give us some picture of what's going on, there's a lot of variability across the country in how well a place is doing. In fact, you know, you can say that these things are worlds apart. So if I take the states here, that's the distribution of growth for states from 2011 to 2015, which is where we have kind of all common data here. And as you can see, there's a couple states, like North Dakota is going to be that far little bar over there. Again, that's thanks to our oil production and shale boom here. So North Dakota, really fast growing economy for a long period of time here. And then Louisiana on the other side, actually been in a recession even during this recovery. When you look at cities or metropolitan areas, this thing gets even wider. So again, we said San Jose, Texas, those are going to be the places out on the right, and then again Louisiana down on the far end here. If I plot this next to global growth, so I took like 185 countries here over the same period, the distribution of growth around the world looks very, very similar to the growth within our own country. So just to kind of keep that in perspective, that there are places, that is, even when the U.S. economy is doing well, there are places in this country that have consistently been in recessions, and places where even when the U.S. economy slows down, they're still booming. So why is that? That's the thing that I'm going to really dive into here. Well, first of all, I think if we look across the country, you know, we started with westward expansion. Well, guess what? It just continues. The West Coast just continues to grow faster than the rest of the country. We see people take from the northeastern states, people are moving out of there, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and generally speaking, growth in the northeastern portion of the country and in the Midwest has been a lot slower. So you're looking at average growth, you know, almost 2.5% in the West. That's going to be the big driver of growth in the nation too, as the population bulk tends to shift over there. When we look in the region, you know, yeah, slower growth is pretty typical. Unfortunately, the St. Louis metro area even is slow for kind of this bulk of these Midwestern states. I see people peeking around, so hopefully, if you don't get a chance to look at these slides, I'm happy to share them afterwards and we'll distribute them. But yeah, St. Louis growth is definitely under 1% on average from over this period of time. Nashville, I think we all know, has been booming for a long time, and that stands out as kind of the outlier. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is take those GDP numbers and decompose it and explain to you why it is that one place is growing faster than the next place. And I think it has some implications for how we interpret the data. Okay, so if anybody took Econ 101, GDP can be broken down by consumption, investment, government spending, and exports. That's kind of the typical way to do this. I'm going to take a different approach here because it allows us to look more regionally at what's going on. Which is to say GDP is a function of how many workers we have and how productive they are. That determines how much output we have. How productive we are is a function of the capital stock that we have, the technologies, and a whole bunch of other things. Workers are going to be a function of how old our population is, number of people moving in, factors like that. But I think it's a pretty straightforward way to think about output for the region. So, you know, how many people we have, what's their propensity to work, and then how educated those people are is also going to tell us how productive they are, as well as kind of what the capital stock looks like in the region. So if I take this decomposition to the U.S. data, this is the picture that I'm going to get here. We got a lot of animation, so let's start here. Okay. So first of all, population growth. So U.S. economy grew over this period 2.2%. So population growth is going to be kind of, what do we have here? About 0.8% of that. So half of the growth in the U.S. economy, or a little less than half of the growth in the economy, is just because we have more people and more people can work. Now, we are aging, so the propensity of those people to work is actually going down. So the labor force participation rate is a bit of a drag on the economy as that's declined, but not much at this point. And then the declines in the unemployment rate. So overall, kind of cyclical factor of people finding jobs, there's better matching, more work, more businesses hiring. That's this big component that you get during these economic expansions that's not going to be kind of typical over longer periods of time. You can work more hours, right? So if people work more hours, you get more output. That's going to be a bit of an add-on here, so people are working longer hours. And then that last piece, which is the productivity part. So how productive people are is contributing about 0.5 percentage point. During the 1990s, we saw growth even faster, where this was making up about 1.5% of GDP growth during these periods of time. So this is where I say, unless population grows faster and we get more people working from that standpoint, unemployment rate can't go much lower. So we need either the population component or the productivity component to pick up if we wanted to see any faster growth over a long period of time. So now when we look one step further, I just want to take this and say, okay, well, population growth is actually twofold. Nationally, there's going to be three parts when we look at the city, which is how many people are moving into the country, as well as just how many kids we're having. So you can break that down even further. And then there's this other piece that's missing for the national, which is domestic migration, which is where people are kind of sorting themselves out across the country. Okay? So this is the way I'm going to break this down, and we'll start looking at different cities. There's a couple caveats that I want to mention that are important for this analysis. We can, you know, they kind of get into some nuance issues, but you have to assume basically that a person's going to be the same within a metro area. We just add up everybody. Their propensity to work is going to be the same on average. It doesn't matter how many their hours worked are going to be the same. It's a reasonable assumption when you average everything together, but it can cause differences across different cities. Very young and very old people work. So if we assume that the flows are about the same, that averages itself out. Nationally, though, birth rates are slowly falling, death rates are slowly accelerating. The labor force participation rate is going to kind of capture this component, so that's kind of the way you can look at that. And then the last piece, regional data are always subject to measurement error. We see really quite significant revisions to some of the regional data, so sometimes we get funky numbers that just don't make any sense, and all you have to do is wait a couple of months or a year or so, and those things go away. Okay, so if I take that component, these components to St. Louis, this is what the picture looks like. So we have net birth, about 0.3% is coming from just adding people through births. But that's more or less just dropping away with domestic migration. So we have more people leaving the area than coming in. And those two things are more or less offsetting each other to be a slight drag here. International migration makes up about 0.2% of growth. So we do have a net inflow of foreign-born workers. Labor force participation rate is taking away from growth. So again, we have an aging population relative to the U.S., even more so. So ability to find workers is even more challenging because we've got more people retiring. So unless they want to work for free and produce output, we're going to struggle there. The unemployment rate's dropped a lot, so the local economy has improved. That's been the biggest component to growth. But people are working fewer hours. This is going to be twofold. I think the way I've kind of come to understand this is it's part people working part-time for non-economic reasons. Either they're going to or they're getting closer to retirement, they're not working as much. That can be a factor here, but that hours worked has been declining. And then last but not least, productivity adds up here. So that's how you get to kind of the 0.8%, with the big drags on growth for the region being people leaving on net and then hours worked and labor force participation pulling away, which is, I would consider this to be a function of the aging of our workforce. So if you put them side by side, this is what the picture looks like. Again, on a labor market's about the same as the national. The big drivers here pulling away are going to be this migration and then this aging of our workforce relative to the national workforce. And that can kind of help explain why the region does grow much slower than the national average. And these things are hard to turn around in short periods of time. I mean, these are long-term challenges that we face in the region. And they could be exacerbated with more time. So when I look kind of across the country, I just want to start first and mention that population growth is pretty much the big reason why the West Coast is growing so much faster than the East Coast in the middle of the country. If you look in the Rocky Mountain area, almost half of the growth is coming just from the fact that they're just adding more people. So it's not that they're necessarily more productive. You're just dumping more people into the area, so these economies have to boom. Versus in the northeastern states, population growth is pretty much flat. So they're getting growth from a lot of different places, productivity being a big piece to this. So I think you can always look and say, the reason they're doing better is they're just adding more people. If you have fixed resources, that means that some of the people there could actually be worse off because they have to share more resources. So population growth isn't always a boom for everybody that's in the region. Now this is a difficult chart to kind of capture everything. I know there's a lot of bars on here, but the piece to take away is if you look up in the top corner here, that dark shaded area is going to be domestic migration. And what you can see is the reason that there's so many places that are growing fast, it's really population shifts to those places. Now what is interesting though, and I'll just highlight a few different places here, you look at Miami, Washington DC, San Jose, San Diego, Boston, LA, and New York. Those are all places in the country where domestic migration is negative for the most part, so people are actually leaving those cities. The reason that their population growth is fast is mostly because that's where the international migration into the country is going. So they're able to offset the people moving out of the region with new people from overseas coming in into that area and working. So those are the big offsets. And in places like Washington D.C. and San Jose, yeah, U.S. citizens are finding the cost unbearable. They don't want to be there anymore. But foreign-born people are moving in and saying this is perfectly fine with us. And they're able to offset that and still have relatively fast population growth. So if we look at the migration piece here, just kind of going back to population again, people moving out east, or east, moving out west. You can see it again in just the migration numbers here. When we look at the productivity component, there's one piece that we keep getting to, which is energy, right? So the energy boom in the middle of plain states is really what's driving the growth in those places, particularly in a place like North Dakota. That's making up over half of the growth in the plain states here, which is quite significant and very positive, which is generally strong for overall well-beings. But productivity growth in kind of the far west is not necessarily as strong, which is why wage growth tends to be a bit slower than what we would hope for. Okay, so if I take this and I just want to break it down one way here and say like, okay, well, why is it that Chicago and Indianapolis are growing faster than St. Louis? And I think there's two things that kind of show up here. One is going to be, if you look down in the bottom left-hand corner, or I did the difference between the Chicago growth rates and the St. Louis growth rates, and I realize hopefully everybody can see these numbers. But there's about a 1 percentage point difference between Chicago and Indianapolis and St. Louis's growth. The reason that growth in Chicago is faster than it is in St. Louis is due to things that I think we would find to be desirable. So it's going to be, you know, their labor force participation rate is staying up higher while ours is dropping. You know, their hours worked hasn't dropped as much as it has here, and productivity's been a bit faster. If we could get those kind of things turned around, to get an extra percentage point of growth from that standpoint is a really positive thing. It means that wages are going to be growing, incomes are going to be going up, and overall well-being could be positive. When you look at a place like Indianapolis, on the other hand, same growth rate as Chicago, but really what they're getting their growth from is just more people in the area. So they're actually seeing negative productivity growth overall. So this could be industry mix changing, people working, you know, in lower wage jobs, for example, things like that, that can be driving it. But it's really driven by population growth. So I think, you know, I'd rather be on the Chicago level than on the Indianapolis level, because those are really the positives that we look for overall well-being. So I always kind of break this out this way, so it kind of gives us a good perspective on what to look for. And to make the point, I think we talk a lot about population, right? You know, the region's population's been stagnant, hasn't been growing a lot. And that can be okay. If we can find ways for overall, you know, to get more capital stock into the region and better paying jobs for the people that are here, and you can educate your workforce, you can kind of keep the population the same, and everybody can be better off. I don't think anybody wants to have a lot of traffic congestion on their way to work every single day. I mean, that's not a positive thing. So there are ways that you can kind of get this growth with maybe slow population growth that's steady and sustainable. And that's kind of the desirable outcome that we really want to look for when we break this down. Okay, so what does this all tell us about the outlook for the region? I'm going to use some fancy charts here, and I'll take a minute to explain it. But basically what I want to do is take the different components and then look at a whole bunch of different indicators to get an idea of where they currently are and if they tell us anything about, you know, what the future population growth looks like or productivity growth and things like that. So what I'm going to do is use these spider charts. So I'm just going to take 1 minute to explain how these things work. In short, I'll take a bunch of different indicators, I'll normalize them so that they all kind of have the same scaling, and then I'll plot them all around the outside here. So indicator A, B, C, D, and E. If you look at indicator A, anything that's, so we're going to be in the red area here. Our peer cities are going to be more or less the cities I showed you earlier on, and then the average is going to be for the whole U.S. Anytime that those red lines are inside of that circle, that would mean that our growth rates are less positive or not as good, so to speak, as kind of a national indicator would be. And then again, same thing for indicator C, and then indicator E over here. So that's kind of how you read this chart. So you want to see the red line kind of all the way to the outside. That would be an indication that these numbers are looking good. When the numbers are in the inside, it means we're lagging behind either national averages or peer averages here. Okay? Everybody with me? Cool. There's the spider. I thank my assistant for that one. He decided that was worth adding on here. Okay, so let's take population growth and say, like, well, is it possible that we can get population growth in the region, and that's what's going to boost growth in the region? And I would say that when you look at kind of a handful of indicators here, from like natural change in our population just due to birth rates, that doesn't look very good. If you look at our migration numbers, those aren't positive. International migration, our share of foreign born in the region is very small, which is probably the best predictor of what foreign immigration is going to look like in the future. The only place that maybe we're kind of moving a little bit closer to the national average is the number of kids that we have. So the number of kids in the region tends to be closer to the national average than, say, the average age of the population. But for the most part, every indicator that we have for the St. Louis region on population is slower than growth is slower than the national average. When you look at the workforce indicators, the one place that we do have a bright spot is this employment to population ratio. So when you look at the overall population, there are more people, the share of the population that's working does tend to be higher. And that's kind of consistent with some of these relatively really low unemployment rates for the region. So that is the one bright spot. But when you look at a lot of these other indicators, for example, disability rates are a lot higher than the national average is. Number of children with disabilities, adults with disabilities, these are people who are probably not going to be working. And so those numbers tend to be very high, which is why they're pushed to the inside. One place that we are on the positive is disconnected youth. So this is going to be people, or youth aged kind of 16 to 21 that are either not in school and they're not working. So that share is relatively low. So that is a positive indicator for the region. But for the most part, I mean, we're still kind of clustered in this middle. So I don't expect to see that natural population growth is going to kind of shift anytime soon. Kind of turning to the next component, productivity growth. This is where I think we do have some really positive things going on in the region. We have great schools. We have kids that are going to school and showing up, teachers that show up to school. On every indicator here, we're pretty much right at the national average, and in a few places, we're actually above the national average. So this does suggest that we can get a lot of gains from productivity growth as a way to boost the region with just the same number of people. So those numbers are very positive. And then when we look at the physical capital numbers, again, transportation times are very low, so that allows us to be more productive in our commutes to work. Interstate system is great, so that's been very good. Trucking reliability, it's not consistent with the other two indicators. I'm kind of confused as to why that number is what it is. I would expect it to be pushed out a little bit more. But I would say, generally speaking, we have great physical infrastructure in the region, particularly when it comes to highways and roads from the transportation and logistics side of things. And if you look around kind of what's happened in the St. Louis region over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, we have seen a real boom in logistics and shipping in the region, and that has been a big positive. Startup rates are relatively low overall. And patents and venture capital money really hasn't flown into this region. We see a lot of startup firms in the St. Louis area that they actually end up moving out west to attract capital. And St. Louis-based venture capital firms also go out west to find investments. So if a St. Louis-based venture capital firm wants to meet a St. Louis-based startup, they got to go out to California and find each other. And that's a problem for the region. But I think we're making some good progress on those. So I do think we have some really positives on our stock. We just got to find ways to better retain these workers. The place I think where we have the greatest potential, and you kind of started this already a little bit here, is our disparity measures tend to be much, much worse than national averages. So if you look at, for example, disparities in the unemployment rate, disparities in homicides, disabilities, this is where we're ultimately going to be able to find more people to show up and work. If you can change kind of this pool of workers that we have, because it's not growing, there's not a lot of indication that it is going to grow, so we have to find the people who are disconnected from the labor force for one reason or another and figure out what we need to do to attract them to work. Because without that, there's just not a whole lot of opportunity to get more people into the pie here. And these things go all the way through. The one place that we do have some pretty good numbers is on education. So we have done a pretty good job of kind of getting college graduation rates and high school graduation rates up for minority and disadvantaged populations. But pushing those people into the workforce in a lot of different ways still hasn't happened the way that we need to. So this is really, I think, one of the keys to longer term growth in the region is getting this part of our population back into the labor force, at least to where it's closer to the national average numbers. Okay, so just kind of wrapping up here, some main thoughts. Overall, the pace of growth is very different from one place to the next. So yeah, San Jose growth looks more like China's growth than it does kind of St. Louis's growth. And that's been stable for a long period of time. So we don't have to look very far to see a place that's been growing at 7% year over year. And we actually have good data on San Jose to prove that that's the case. Decomposing growth can kind of help explain what's generating growth in different places. So take Portland, Oregon, and St. Louis, for example. They both are growing about 1% a year. Portland's growth is pretty much coming all from domestic migration. So you're just dumping a lot more people onto a fixed number of resources. And in St. Louis, we're seeing pretty much the opposite. So fewer people, but more gains in productivity. But the final numbers turn out about the same. So those pose completely different challenges to how to accelerate growth and how to handle the problems that are caused by it. And kind of the last piece here is going to be, this knowledge economy, the share of of our workers that have a college degree. It's been positively correlated with domestic migration rates for a long time and productivity growth. So anything that we can do to try to find ways to boost educational attainment in the region is going to ultimately boost productivity, and in the long term, maybe not turn domestic migration positive, but at least stem the flow of people leaving the region because there'll be additional opportunities. And then, like I said before, really ability to reduce the disparities and find ways to retain youth to this region. So if anybody has kids, do everything you possibly can to get them to come back home. Offer free rent, whatever you need to do. Help them find a job, and then once they have kids, they're never going to want to leave anyways because they need the free babysitting. So do whatever you can do to really help, keep those people around the region, because that's the only way that we're actually going to see those population numbers turn around. So with that, just want to plug all of our publications are free. Tim used a whole bunch of Fred graphs, so all data from the St. Louis Fed's also free. You can go onto our website and pull these reports and general commentary down. So that's something to kind of keep an eye out, and we'll send the slides out. So with that, thank you very much.
Again, thank you. Have a wonderful day. Be safe.